I'm Michael Causey, and on this, the occasion of David Searby's 50th birthday, on Tuesday, many have asked me to offer my recollections on the David Searby I've known and loved, still know, and still love. So let me take you back to a different time, a different era, the 1980s. Yes, we can laugh about it now, but it was a serious time in the 80s. Fashions were scary. Inflation was scary. Communism was scary. But into that darkness arose a light I like to call the knee slappers. The knee slappers have been called by some to be Monty Python without jokes. And I believe I see that some of you maybe don't even know who the knee slappers were, which is odd. But the knee slappers, of which I was half, were a gifted comedy troupe that was formed in the 1980s in the home of David Searby, under the watchful eye of Joan Searby, David's mother, and our biggest patron. She was very helpful, poking her head in sometimes during our recording sessions to ask us to be quiet, and we respected that very much. But anyway, back to my story. In the 80s, it was the knee slappers' hope and dream to help guide America out of the darkness and into the light. I worked with David Searby for many years as a knee slapper, as a friend, as a consort. And I'd like to tell you a few of my recollections about David and what a special guy he is as we think back on David's life, the first 50 years, if you will, and the second 50 years, we all hope. David and I wrote our skits generally separately. In the early days, as we were learning our craft, we noticed that our endings of our skits tended to be a little predictable. David's tended to have fade-outs with a big explosion. Mine tended to end with fade-outs and a big fight. One of my early skits, unfortunately I can't recall the name of it, but I do remember that at the end I wanted to have a fade-out with an argument about the merits of communism. As I was not very familiar with communism, except knowing that the Russians had something to do with it and we were against it, I sort of copped out at the end of my skit and I just wrote, fade out with argument about communism. So as David and I were doing the skit, amusing ourselves and possibly Mrs. Searby at the same time, as the skit came to the end, the only thing I really had to say was, I'm against communism. David proceeded on his feet to rattle off things about the workers controlling the means of production, Lenin building on the arguments of Marx, or something like that. And he went on as we faded out with this very intelligent discussion of communism. And I thought to myself, this guy's very smart. And I was very impressed. But there's more to talk about with David Searby. And again, I'd like to share it with you through the filter of the knee slappers. I've talked about David being nice. I'd also like to talk about the drive, if you will, of David Searby. He's a man who's gifted with a vision and the means to implement that vision, but to do it in a classy way. I'd like to give an example. I've alluded to the early days of the knee slappers. We had 1.5 fans. I count Mrs. Searby as half. David's younger brother, Bruce, until he was about 8 years old, thought we were very funny, so he was a fan up to 8. After 8, less. But I like to think of the early days. At any rate, working with David was a pleasure, always. But I remember a particular time where we were lamenting the fact that we didn't have many listeners, or fans, or frankly anyone interested with any of the work we did. It was David who came up with the excellent idea to try to take our wares somewhere else. And David had the confidence that frankly I lacked. We drove around town. I stayed in the car. David approached WPFW. They said no. He approached WAVA. They said no. He approached several other stations beginning with W. They all said no. Then we went to WAMU, the AM version, not the FM version. And David went in boldly and approached the program manager, who was about 20, and we thought perhaps the coolest person on earth because we were about 17. David approached him and pitched what is now known in American university history as the Knee Slapper show aired every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock. You did have to drive around the AU parking lots to hear the show. It was a little weak in Lot 4. Lot 5, you could pick it up pretty nicely. That was kind of our sweet spot. But I remember after David went into AU and came back out while I was waiting in the car, he told me he'd secured us a radio show. And I thought, that guy has drive. That guy's got something special. And that guy's driving a K car. I'd like to talk a little bit more about David before summing up briefly. Again, working with David as one of the Knee Slappers was a life-changing experience for me, but it told me more about David, perhaps, than it told me about myself. Let me explain. I've talked about David being nice. I've talked about him being driven. I've talked about him being intelligent. But let me tell you another side of David. That same day we were driving to WAMU, the AM version, not the FM version, I noticed as we were driving that David had brought a sample cassette of our work. He labeled my skits in blue, his in black. It said the Knee Slappers on the spine of the cassette. For those of you not familiar with cassettes, they looked roughly like this. And I noticed he'd put my name first on the cassette. And I thought, that's a really kind thing. He's a kind guy. I certainly wouldn't have done that for him. So, in summing, on his 50th birthday, I'd like you to remember and cherish the David as I knew him. The kind, smart, driven, and blonde person that we all consider lucky to be in our lives. So, from all of me to all of you, I'd just like to wish you, David, a happy 50th birthday. Many happy returns. Many more to come. And I'm thinking about you. Love you. Thanks for being in my life.